First of all, I would like to introduce our special lecturer first. It is my great pleasure to introduce a plenary lecturer from Sri Lankan International Buddhist Academy, or SIBA, Professor P.D.Premasiri. So he is assigned by Sri Lankan International Buddhist Academy, SIBA. Professor P.D.Premasiri is Professor Emeritus of Pali and Buddhist Studies, Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies, University of Pradenia, Sri Lanka. He did Master of Arts from the University of Cambridge, England. And then he obtained the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Philosophy from the University of Hawaii on the topic Moral Evaluation in Early Buddhism from the perspective of Western philosophical analysis. He is visiting professor, Department of Philosophy and Religion, Colby College, Waterville, main state of GSA. The courses he taught Buddhist ethics, fact and value. His comments research on
recording in progress.
Doctrinal approaches to human sexuality for purposes of comparisons with Buddhism. He attended the annual art meeting of the American Association of Religion held in Chicago. He also visited University of North Carolina, and he got many prizes. Like he won the prize for Pali subject awarded to the best student in the final degree examination. Universities of Ceylon, Pradenia. He got government university scholarships in Oriental Studies, University of Ceylon. Pradenia East-West Center scholarship for postgraduate work in comparative philosophy at the University of Hawaii, USA. Fulbright scholar in residence fellowship attached to the Department of Philosophy and Religion, Colby College, Waterville, Maine State. And his guest researcher award, he also got guest research award from University of Bergen, Norway. And he got Buddhist Award for service to Buddhist running in July 2006. And he has written many books and articles on Buddhism. That today, the afternoon session, special lecturer is a plenary speaker or lecturer on the Buddhism. The topic he's going to give a special lecture is Theravada Buddhism, Origin, Development, and its essence from India to Sri Lanka. Students and participants, please welcome Professor P.D.Premasiri from Sri Lanka. He is going to give us a special lecture from 1 o'clock up to 3:30. Please pay attention to his lecture from now. Yes, sir, please.
Good afternoon, Professor.
I'm Metapan.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Dr. Dick. You can call me Dr. Dick. Okay, sir, welcome. Yeah, please.
So may I begin?
Yeah, you can begin,
Okay.
sir. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for the very detailed introduction to my academic background. I'm very gladdened by those comments. So I will try to do justice within the coming 2 hours and a half or so to this topic, Theravada Buddhism, origin, development, and its essence from India to Sri Lanka. So the early part of the lecture will be related to the background, that is how Theravada Buddhism gained a special identity as a school of Buddhism, and what other schools existed during that time, during the early period, and what the relationship between Theravada and those schools were, and how the Theravada came to Sri Lanka and it became the dominant Buddhist tradition in the Sri Lankan context. Theravada is the school of Buddhism that is predominant currently in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia. It is known in modern times, even in some parts of the Western world, like, for instance, Britain, United Kingdom, USA, not very widely, but there is a considerable section of modern Western Buddhists who accept Theravada as a more rational system of Buddhist thought, not so much given to ritual and other practices, but emphasizing mind training and taking a more rational approach. Although in the history of Buddhism, there were many different schools, only Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana have come to be the three major traditions known today. All these different schools, as they appeared in past history and are in existence today, originated from the teachings of Gautama Buddha. So whatever the school of Buddhism is and whatever views they hold on the teaching of the Buddha, they all can be traced back to the original teachings of Gautama Buddha. It is important to make a distinction between what we may identify as early Buddhism. I think this usage came mainly from the Western interpreters of Buddhism, who actually adopted a kind of critical and historical method in the study of Buddhist teachings. It is important to make a distinction between what we may identify as early Buddhism that can be traced to the original founder of the system, and all the later doctrinal systems that developed as the Buddhist tradition. So the Buddhist tradition has lasted over so many centuries from the time the system was founded by Gautama Buddha as its original founder. The Theravada claim is that as a distinct Buddhist school, it has faithfully preserved the original words of the Buddha in the sutta collections belonging to the school, while also in the history of the tradition, it has safeguarded the words of the Buddha from attempts at misinterpretation. That is a claim that is usually made by the adherents of the Theravada tradition. According to the Theravada viewpoint, there are instances in which other schools of Buddhism introduce doctrines that are incompatible with the original teachings of the Buddha. Such schools claimed that the Buddha taught a higher teaching to a selected group of disciples, emphasizing that the ultimate goal of every follower of the Buddha's teaching ought to be the attainment of proper and full enlightenment, Samma Sambodhi, and that one should not aspire to attain enlightenment as an arahat in one's immediate lifetime, but aspire to be a bodhisattva who will attain omniscient, full enlightenment as Gautama Buddha himself did after fulfilling perfections over a lengthy period of samsaric life. Now, this doesn't seem to be the Theravada viewpoint. The Theravada viewpoint derived directly from the early canonical standpoint is that one ought to commit oneself to attain liberation from suffering at the earliest possible opportunity. And the Buddha himself is understood as a teacher who insisted on this when he said, Appamadena sampadeta, do not be negligent. You should immediately try to relieve yourself of suffering. And you ought to attain the goal of liberation in this immediate life, not to postpone it until you yourself become a fully enlightened Buddha. So we find that in later Buddhist traditions, like the tradition represented in the Saddharma Pundarika, which is well known as the lotus of the good law. There, the attitude is very different. It is really critical of the Theravada and the other Buddhist traditions which they saw as inferior traditions, and that is why they call them Hinayana, because they thought that those traditions were emphasizing immediate release for oneself, and they conceived it as a self-centered approach, whereas what is more important and what may be conceived as a greater commitment, a higher commitment, is to commit oneself to liberate countless living beings by becoming an enlightened one, fully enlightened one oneself. Instead of the Arahat ideal, which was very much emphasized in the Theravada tradition, they are developed a tradition which is opposed to that ideal, calling it a self-centered one. And the emphasis from that point onwards was on what was conceived as the Bodhisattva ideal. So the Bodhisattva gained very much prominence in these later systems. While in the Theravada tradition, it is not proposed that everyone should aspire to become a bodhisattva, in the sense that one's ultimate goal is going to be the attainment of full enlightenment as Gautama Buddha himself attained. Instead, the emphasis is on liberating oneself as early as possible. So this actually resulted in this division between two ideals, as the Arahat ideal, which came to be emphasized mainly by schools like the Theravada, and the Bodhisattva ideal, which came to be emphasized by the Mahayanist tradition. So, division of opinion on what the ultimate goal of the Buddha's teaching was led to the distinction at a certain point in the history of Buddhism between two vehicles, as I just mentioned, which were called the lower vehicle, Hinayana, and the higher vehicle, Mahayana. This distinction was made by those who professed the teachings of the Mahayana, the latter vehicle, considering teachings of the former to be inferior in comparison with their own Mahayana standpoint. As I said, there is very much emphasis on this point in the later Buddhist tradition, which is represented in a text like the Saddharma Pundarika. When we examine the historical process of the development of Buddhist teachings, there may be justification for the view that it is the Theravada school of Buddhism that best preserved the teachings of the Buddha in its original form, and also made attempts to further analyze it in ways that conformed to the original form. So even the analysis adopted by the Theravada tradition tried as far as possible to conform to the original teaching. Thus, the Theravada never shifted from the doctrinal affirmation of the humanness of the Buddha. So the Buddha was conceived as human. Although it introduced many new ideas relating to physical and intellectual qualities of the Buddha, going beyond those characteristics attributed to the Buddha in the canonical tradition. So there was actually interaction between other schools of Buddhism also in this process. And it became necessary at a certain point to attribute certain marvelous bodily attributes to the Buddha, intellectual attributes to the Buddha, like the Sata Punya Lakkana, the hundreds of marks of merit, which developed at a later time. And they were actually, those later ideas were shared by other schools of Buddhism, which were developing in the Mahayana direction as well. Actually, in the early canonical sources also, it is to be noted that the Buddha was not conceived as just an ordinary human being. He was considered as human, but he was seen as an extraordinary human being. So from the very beginning, we find that distinctive bodily features. There is much mention of his bodily beauty, his very beautiful appearance, and also a host of intellectual qualities which are supposed to have not been shared with his most eminent disciples. So the Buddha had something called asadharana jnana, unshared intellectual attainments. And that goes back even to the earliest parts of the Buddhist canonical literature. In the opinion of modern scholars, who, as I said, take a critical and historical viewpoint, it is possible to identify a nucleus of Buddhist teachings based primarily on the Sutta sources shared by different schools of Buddhism, as those teachings attributable to the Buddha himself. Now, if you take the sutras preserved in the early Chinese agamas, you might find very close affinities between the body of canonical literature that is preserved in the Theravada Pali tradition and the doctrinal points of view preserved in the early Chinese Agama literature, which actually existed sometime in the early period in some form of Buddhist Sanskrit and later taken to China and translated into Chinese. So it is proper to think of what we may call the words of the Buddha. The words of the Buddha, Buddha Vachana, as opposed to Buddhism. We can make such a distinction from a critical and historical point of view. It is because Buddhism was an evolving system of thought, and it branched off into different schools based on the particular interpretative approach adopted by each different school. Theravada also may be seen as one such school, and therefore it is proper to see a distinction even between early or original Buddhism and Theravada. So what I'm trying to argue for, or the reasoning behind my exposition of Buddhism, is that we can make a distinction between Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha, and any other sectarian development which took place in the history of Buddhism. So although from a historical and critical point of view, Theravada may be conceived as closer to the word of the Buddha, when you take the historical process of development in the Theravada, we can see that Theravada also introduced new doctrinal elements, but they were more compatible with the original word of the Buddha than most other Buddhist traditions that developed at a later time. So it is from that standpoint that I have made this distinction between the original teaching of the Buddha and Theravada. The original teaching of the Buddha was more inclined towards a pragmatic or a practical approach. The emphasis was on the attainment of the goal of peace and tranquility. The teaching as shown in the Brahmajala Sutta, the very first discourse included in the Theravada first collection called the Digha collection, Digha Nikaya, its emphasis is on the transcendence of all dogmatic views, ditthi. There is a real criticism of the tendency of people to cling to dogmas and ditthis. The Buddha referred to his attainment as transcending logic and speculative theorization, calling what he taught atakkavachara, not to be examined in terms of theological reasoning. The approach of sophistic, logical reasoning. He emphasized the practical relevance of the teaching and did not go into theoretical elaborations. So we see that the early canonical teaching was a very simple, practical teaching which guided people to work out their liberation as early as possible. The teachings contain many aspects of doctrine which could be subjected to deep and intense rational analysis. The statements were very brief. They were actually presented with a practical and pragmatic concern. So there was not much elaboration of concepts. it was a very simple teaching, providing the most effective kind of practical guidance. It is important to recognize the distinction between the original teaching of the Buddha and Theravada, because the latter refers to a particular school of Buddhist thought that came to be known with that specific identity at a certain point in the history of Buddhism. So this identity, called the Theravada identity, appeared at a certain point in the history of Buddhism. There is a mistaken attempt to trace the Theravada to the time of the Buddha himself, depending on a statement in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha says, Theravadam cha vadam. There, Theravadam cha vadami does not at all stand for the Theravada that we understand today. And it has been observed by modern scholars that here what the Buddha affirms is that what he speaks is very definite. Thera used there in the sense not of elder, as it came to be used at a later time, elders of the Bhikkhu community, but in the sense of thira. Thira means very definite, very certain. So the Buddha was speaking matters that were very certain to him. It is in that sense that Theravada, in that particular use, may be understood. So the meaning expressed here does not have a connection with any particular doctrinal theory or school, but only with the certainty of the assertions made by the Buddha. However, Theravada appears to have been referred to by that name because it came to be recognized in the history of Buddhism as the doctrine resulting from the way the teachings of the Buddha were understood and preserved by the generation of reputed senior monks or elders who lived during the Buddha's time. It was initially from the time of the Second Buddhist Council that Theravada came to be identified as a distinct school of Buddhism. And such identity appears to have become more pronounced after the period of the Third Buddhist Council. So when considering the development of the Theravada tradition, the Buddhist councils that are supposed to have been held in the early period of the development of Buddhism seem to be extremely relevant. During the lifetime of the Buddha, tendencies to misinterpret the teaching were seen. There are instances mentioned in the early canonical sources themselves, where some of the immediate disciples of the Buddha made attempts to give their own interpretations of the teaching. Two major instances are reported in the suttas. One instance was Aritta, a monk named Aritta, who happened to be formerly a trainer of vultures, Gaddabadipubba. And he's supposed to have proposed a wrong view regarding the Buddha's teaching. Then the second wrong view was, it is attributed in the canonical sources to Sati, a person named Sati. Now, the Buddha was there to deal with such misinterpretations of the teaching. On one occasion, it is evident that a person like Sati, for instance, suggested that the Buddha has taught certain things that may be called harmful practices. Antarayika Dhamma. Antarayika means that pose danger to the moral life. But Sati was inclined to seek some opening to enjoy sensuous pleasures. So he maintained that although the Buddha has talked about these harmful practices, there is no harm in indulging in some of those things, some of those practices. Whereas Arittha was someone who proposed that there is a permanent state called consciousness which passes from one life to another. Viññānaṁ sandhavati sansarati ananyam. Consciousness is an entity that runs around from one life to another without undergoing any change. So Arittha wanted to interpret consciousness as something similar to a soul substance, a permanent entity. So on both these occasions, the Buddha was there to correct them. Then we also hear of the Buddha's own relative, Devadatta, who was his cousin. He is also mentioned as one who attempted to break up the order, introducing certain practices that the Buddha did not approve of. The Kosambhya Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya also mentions of an occasion when disunity had arisen in the Bhikkhu community. And the Buddha himself is supposed to have withdrawn into a forest dwelling because he could not manage such disunity. The Buddha presented his teachings in a context in which there was a very strong tradition of Brahmanical learning and speculation. The society of the time was strongly influenced by the dominant Brahmanical ideology, while there were also other non-orthodox philosophical systems emerging as a reaction to Brahmanical orthodoxy. The necessity arose at a very early period to identify the essentials of the teaching and preserve those essentials so that no dissentient views would arise in the future. The disunity that arose in the Jaina Sasana became an eye-opener to the Buddhist community. Therefore, attempts were made by the early community to identify the core of the teaching and rehearse it together without leaving room for disagreement. The Sangiti Sutta indicates such an early attempt. Sangiti Sutta, which is now preserved in the Digha Nikaya. Now, coming to later tendencies for different factions within Buddhism to come up, we can first go to the period immediately after the Buddha's demise. That is the first council. After the Buddha passed away, one of the senior most disciples of the Buddha, Venerable Mahakassapa, thought that it is important to rehearse the teaching of the Buddha, to establish what actually was taught by Gautama Buddha, so that it may be preserved as the original teaching of the Master. So Venerable Mahakassapa took the initiative to convene the first Buddhist council, about which almost all Buddhist schools, which later separated, also agreed. The first council was the earliest attempt after the passing away of the Buddha to come to a common agreement regarding the entire content of the teaching of the Buddha, as the Dhamma he taught and the Vinaya he promulgated. According to most scholars who take a historical and critical point of view, at this stage, the kind of analytical tradition which led to the development of Abhidhamma, the higher Dhamma, had not yet come into being. So in the earliest Buddhist sources, like the Chulavagga, which records the councils, only talk about the rehearsal of the Dhamma and the Vinaya. There is no mention of Abhidhamma, although when it comes to the commentarial period in the 5th century CE, the Abhidhamma also is included as the content of the Dhamma and Vinaya, that Dhamma which was rehearsed at the first council. The first council account shows that there were other senior monks like Purana who did not participate in the proceedings of the first council, who would have wanted to understand the teachings as they themselves had directly come to know it from the Buddha. So the first council was held by 500 monks who were selected for the purpose. And after completing the rehearsal of the Dhamma and Vinaya, the Venerable Mahakassapa met Venerable Purana, who did not participate, and informed him that the Dhamma and Vinaya were rehearsed, and Venerable Purana was very happy about it. He said, "It's good that you have convened this council and rehearsed, but however, I would like to keep in mind the Dhamma and Vinaya as I have myself directly heard it from the Buddha." it may be said that the events leading to the Second Council and the subsequent emergence of the first schismatic group called the Mahasangika were primarily due to disagreements on matters relating to discipline and interpretations of the doctrine. So, around 100 years or a little more than 100 years after the passing away of the Buddha, the necessity arose to check certain practices to which the Buddhist community resorted, which was taught by the more conservative Buddhist monks as going against the teaching of Gautama Buddha. So there were disagreements relating to the doctrinal positions as well, not only disagreements relating to discipline, but also disagreements relating to certain doctrinal points, particularly about the nature of the attainment of the Arhat and the fully enlightened Buddha. Now we see that it is this disagreement that led to the development of non-Theravada schools of Buddhism with different viewpoints regarding the Buddhist goal. We see that an attempt to gain analytical understanding of the basic doctrinal concepts of the teaching arose within the community as a development which was noticeable quite early in the history of Buddhism. Discussions on those lines came to be known as Abhidhamma Katha, that is, talk regarding the higher Dhamma or talk relating to the Dhamma itself. Actually, some scholars interpret Abhidhamma Katha as talks about the Dhamma or discussions relating to the Dhamma, not in the sense of higher Dhamma, but in the sense of relating to the Dhamma. We see that this development became more pronounced after the first split arose and divergent Abhidhamma traditions began to spring up, reflecting rational, logical, speculative, and philosophical attempts to redefine and establish the specific ontological character of the Buddha's teaching. So some of the disagreements that began to arise were mainly on these aspects. This actually happened within the different schools that tried to establish the respective schools' interpretation. Now, I have indicated here some of the sources for the Second Council. The Pali sources I have indicated here, then Tibetan sources, which scholars have taken into account, Chinese sources. So from these sources, we can make many inferences about the developments that took place at a certain time in the history of the Buddhist tradition. Now we shall pay attention to this topic, the emergence of schools of Buddhism. The first split in the Buddhist order goes back to the period after the Second Council, around 110 years after the passing away of the Buddha. Chullavagga account in the Vinaya Pitaka of the Second Council mentions the 10 points of Vinaya violation by Vajjian monks as the immediate cause of the council. So those 10 points are, I think, very familiar to most of us. They are enumerated in the Chullavagga account. According to the Chullavagga account, the monk named Yasa, observing the practice by Vesali monks of receiving gold and silver in the form of alms, protested against it, maintaining that it went against the rules of discipline. That is, handling money. It is against certain Pācitya rule. The Vesali monks, angered by this act of Yasa, expelled him from the order. And Yasa firmly believed that he was acting according to the code of discipline promulgated by the Buddha himself. And he traveled west to seek the support of the monks in that region for his standpoint on discipline. Eventually, the matter was taken up for consideration by a committee of monks representing the disputing parties. But due to unending conflicts of opinion, the attempt at resolving the dispute failed. So this was what happened at the Second Council stage. This led to a major schism in the Buddhist order. It was at this point that two schools of Buddhism came into being, as the Theravada and the Mahasangika. The large majority of monks considered that the committee decision was in favor of the conservative group, and they separated from the original community because they desired a relaxation of the stringent rules that were governing the community at that time. So since they were in a majority, they came to be known as the Mahasangha. So that's how the identification in terms of Mahasangika came into being. They came to be known as Mahasangika because the large majority were with the group that opposed the conservative group, who were in a minority. So in numbers, actually the conservative group was in a minority. Mahasangika Vinaya also gives prominence to the act of collecting money by the Sangha as a cause for convening the Second Council. It also considers Yasa as the person who presided at the council. There are divergent versions regarding the event, while there is also considerable agreement regarding the holding of a second council. So the descriptions may have become divergent through the course of history, but there is some nucleus of historical truth also behind what has been described in the early texts. The extent to which the matters related to the Second Council happened to be an immediate cause for the secession of the group, that is the breakup of the community, that came to be known as Maha Sangika, leading to the first split in the order, is uncertain. There are certain doubts about it, but however, there should be some core of truth in these records that we come across. Kathavattu was composed as a book of the Theravada Abhidhamma Pitaka, the text called Kathavattu. It was composed in about 246 BCE by Venerable Moggali Puttatissa as a polemical text to refute the wide variety of Buddhist heretical views that had come into existence by that time. It presents them as controversies at which the heretical points of view were debated and refuted from the Theravada point of view. It is uncertain as to whether all those controversies, numbering 219, existed during the time of King Asoka, the period in which the text was composed. In the Kathavattu itself, no mention is made of the different schools to which the various theories could be attributed. That information is supplied by its commentary. The three principal dogmas that probably existed by the time it was composed were the personality heresy. They were all considered as heresies from the Theravada point of view. The personality heresy, which is called Puggalavada. Then the second major heresy was the all exists heresy, Sabbhativada, which is called Sarvastivada in Sanskrit. That is the reality of tri-temporal existence. This is the second heresy that the Theravada tradition was opposed to. And the third major heresy related to the nature of the Buddha. So out of the heretical views that developed, we could actually identify these three as the major heresies which were opposed by the Theravadics. On the basis of the information derived from the commentary to the Kathavattu, Venerable Jnanatiloka has classified the schools into 18 as schools separating from the Mahasangika and the Theravada as follows. So Mahasangika at the top, then we have Ekabboharika, Gokulika, Panyattivadin, Bahulika, Chetiyavadi, 6 schools under Mahasangika, including Mahasangika. And then we have Theravadin, Mahisasaka, Sabbattivadin, Kassapika, Sankantika, Suttavadin, Dhammayuttika, Vajjiputtaka, Dhammuttariya, Channagarika, Bhadrayanika, Sammitiya. Now it is difficult to find any systematically preserved doctrines belonging to most of these traditions. The only remaining scriptural sources that we can find for a study of the differences between the ideologies of the different schools happen to be from the Theravada and the Sarvastivada traditions. So, out of these, only the 8 groups, Vajjiputtaka, Mahishasaka, Mahasangika, Gokulika, Sabbattivada, Sammitiya, Bhadrayanika, Kassapika, can be considered as those that existed during King Asoka's time. Venerable Jnanatiloka points out that there are other names also mentioned in the Kathavastu, like Hetuvadin, Uttarapataka, Andaka, Pubbaselya, Aparaselya, Rajagirika, Siddharthaka, Vetulyaka. And out of these, the 4th, 5th, and the 6th are considered not to be different from the Andaka. Then the Western scholar, A.K. Warder, puts together the information from different sources and mentions a list of as many as 25 schools which are not identified with the major Mahayana schools that came into being after the Christian era. So I have included the list of 25 schools mentioned by the scholar A.K. Warder. Details about the first schism leading to the emergence of the Mahasangika school and the separation of the more conservative group which subscribed strictly to the doctrine as preserved by the most senior members of the order, Theras as they were called, are found in Sri Lankan chronicles, Pali and Buddhist Sanskrit works, extant in Tibetan and Chinese translations. Their original Sanskrit form is lost. Moggaliputtatissa's Kathavattu and Vasumitra's Samaya Bedopacharana Chakra indicate the special tenets of the Mahasangika school. Bhavya, Vasumitra, Vinitadeva, and Taranatha trace the origin of the school to the 5 points raised by Mahadeva. So that was a different explanation of the causes for the split. The first 4 of the points are mentioned in the Kathavattu. They were all about the Arahat's attainment. So According to Mahadeva, the arahats are not fully liberated, and they could fall from their liberation. They could commit morally unwholesome actions. Although in the early period, according to the Arahat ideal, an Arahat was considered as a perfect person. The Buddha himself was called Arahat. But when it comes to this kind of development, the Arahat ideal came to be sort of seen as an inferior ideal. So this kind of tendency has paved the way for the emergence of the Mahayana ideal at a later time, which came to be emphasized in later Buddhist texts like the Saddharma Pundarika, as I mentioned earlier. There is agreement between Vasumitra's work and the Kathavattu with regard to the essential tenets of the Mahasangikas, showing that the school existed before the compilation of the Kathavattu. The Mahasangika group was formed probably as a protest against the conservatism of the Theras or Staviras, the senior elders who were not disposed to any flexibility regarding the disciplinary rules and who considered arahats as perfect beings. It is possible that the reclusive attitudes of those who followed the ideal of arahat came to be challenged by a large group who wanted laxity, not only regarding the interpretation of discipline, but also the interpretation of the Dhamma. And this is reflected in some of the literature that came into being at a later period in the Buddhist Sanskrit tradition. According to the Deepavansa, the Mahasangika held their own council and even adopted at this council their own version of the Buddha's teachings. They are said to have arbitrarily replaced the doctrines according to their liking. It is said that they refused to include Parivara, Abhidhamma Pakarana, Patisambhida Magga, Niddesa, and the Jataka within the Pitaka collection. Yuan Shuang, a Chinese commentator, also states that the Mahasangikas, while accepting the canon as rehearsed by Mahakassapa at the first council, also included some of their own works. So we find that the later Buddhists of different traditions tried to introduce or they made attempts at interpolation of texts into the canonical body of literature. The first group of sects comprising the Mahasangika, Eka Vyavaharika and Chetyaka, they came to be known as Lokottaravadins, generally had common doctrines with minor differences. Kathavattu shows that a large number of doctrines have been attributed to the second group, referred to as the Shailas or the Andakas. This group accepted some of the doctrines of the Sarvastivadins. Now, in order to see a major difference between the Theravada viewpoint and certain developments that took place in the history of Buddhism, I have drawn attention to the Mahasangika doctrine of a transcendental Buddha. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning that a distinctive character of Theravada Buddhism is that Theravada Buddhism did not deviate from the tradition that the Buddha was human. But here we find a different concept being introduced. There are texts like the Mahavastu, which were composed by these traditions to emphasize the kind of transcendental concept of a Buddha. So diverse views which were in conflict with the views of the Theravada were held by the subsects of the Mahasangika group. And Lokottaravada is one of the most important branches of the Mahasangika, which introduced a lot of doctrines that later developed under the Mahayana tradition. So this Lokottaravada was actually a turning point in Buddhist history. The Mahavastu is considered as one of their Vinaya texts, but it contains more of the biography of the Buddha than Vinaya matters. The tendency to deify the Buddha seems very evident in the Mahavastu. Mahavastu is the first volume of the Vinaya Pitaka of the Lokottaravadins. In this text, we find an account of the Buddha's biography divided into 3 sections. So there must have been a common body of tradition on which the Mahavastu also depended. Like the Jataka Nidana Katha of the Theravada, here too, the Buddha's biography is divided into 3 sections. Now, the Jataka Nidana, the commentarial description of the Buddha's biography, although composed in the 5th century CE, its ideas come from a much earlier period, from the tradition of the Sihala commentaries, the Sihala commentaries that were known from about the time of the introduction of Buddhism to Sri Lanka. So the 3 periods to which the Buddha's biography is divided is first the Dipankara story, and stories relating to other Buddhas are mentioned in the Mahavastu. Second, the Bodhisattva's life in Tushita heaven is mentioned. Finally, there is an account of his present life in the Mahavagga, as in the Mahavagga of the Theravada Vinaya Pitaka. So, to some extent, there is shared content in the Theravada tradition and this Lokottaravada tradition. Lokottaravadins had doctrines that came to be developed later by the Mahayanists. They actually prepared the ground for the advent of the Mahayana. So actually, Lokottaravada was the precursor. A large number of views admitted by the developing Mahasangika groups almost revolutionized the concept of Buddha. Mahavastu maintains that the Buddha was transcendental and that his body was apparitional in this world. There was no real physical body that the Buddha possessed in the human world. It was merely an appearance. It was apparitional, according to the Lokottaravada. And he taught in his created body. And all actions he exhibited in his physical form in this world were merely to be in conformity with the world. So, in the Mahavastu, there is reference to this term. There is use of this term, Lokanuvartana. Lokanuvartana means keeping to the ways of this world. So it's not real, but the Buddha just kept to the ways of this world. The Kathavattu deals with this as a Buddhist heresy. So the Theravadins did not accept that viewpoint. So in Theravada, this view is criticized in the Kathavattu, which was the major Theravada polemical text that rejected what Theravadins conceived as Buddhist heresies. And it maintained, the Kathavattu maintained, that this heresy was a consequence of misunderstanding the Buddha's statement that although he was born in the world, he lived like a lotus, untainted by the world. According to the Mahasangikas, the Bodhisattvas also are considered as supramundane. They don't belong to this world. They are supramundane. So I have outlined some of the Mahasangika views which are really opposed to the Theravadin standpoint. The Mahasangikas and their offshoots held the Buddha's body is entirely supramundane. Bodily, verbal, and mental actions are dissociated from impurities. The body is not of this world. It is not laukika. It is purity only. The Buddha's body is anashrava matra, and it is indestructible. They believe that the real body of the Buddha is not destructible. But we find that according to the Theravada tradition, the Buddha's body was subject to all the frailties, the weaknesses that any human body is subject to. Although at the same time, certain characteristics came to be attributed from the very early period that were considered as distinctive characteristics of the Buddha's body. His material body, Rupakaya, they considered it as Nirmanakaya, is unlimited as a result of his unlimited past merits. It can be either large or small and of any number. In his created body, he could appear anywhere in the universe. So, Kathavattu, this chapter 17, attributed these two views to the Vetullakas. And in the Sri Lankan Theravada tradition, or in the Indian Theravada tradition, the Vetullakas were seen as those who followed the Mahayana Vaipulya Sutras. So Vetulla may be a corruption from the term Vaipulya. This view is referred to as Abhinimmito Jino. That means the Buddha's body is a created body, a specially created body. It's not a natural body. The Buddha does not live in the world of men. It is in his created form that he delivered his discourses. The Buddha's length of life is unlimited on account of his past accumulated merits. He lives as long as sentient beings live. So actually, the Buddha is turned to become an eternal being. Buddha's divine power, Tejas or Prabhava, is unlimited. He can appear in one moment in all the worlds of the universe. The Buddha is never tired of enlightening sentient beings. The Buddha's mind is always in meditation. He neither sleeps nor dreams. The Buddha can comprehend everything in one moment. Ekakshanika chitta. His mind is like a mirror. This is referred to in the Kathavattu as Sabbasmin Pachuppannang Jnanang Atti. Sabbasmin Pachuppannang Jnanang Atti. That is, with regard to everything, his knowledge is present, in the present. Actually, this goes against a canonical statement that the Buddha himself made. He said that he can know many things, but he has to direct his attention to know. He doesn't have all the knowledge at every single moment. And the Buddha attributed that kind of omniscience to certain other teachers with whom the Buddha disagreed, like Nigantanatha Putta, the Jaina, the founder of the Jain sect. The Abhidharma Kosha and its Vyakhya, the commentary, say that according to the Mahasanghikas, Buddhas appear at the same time in more than one world, which again goes against the Theravada viewpoint. And that they are omniscient in the sense that they know all dharmas at the same time. So that is actually not in agreement with the Theravada viewpoint of Buddha's omniscience. Mahavastu marks the beginnings of many new conceptions regarding the Bodhisattva as well. The Bodhisattva is, in his final birth, is Upapaduka, which means self-born, so of spontaneous birth, and not born of parents, according to the Mahavastu. The Bodhisattva sits cross-legged in the mother's womb and preaches to the gods. He has no lust. Therefore, Rahula was also self-born, the Buddha's son. All his bodily movements are merely to be in conformity with the world, as I said, Lokanuvartana. Material is found in the Mahasangika conception, about the Mahasangika conception of Bodhisattva in Vasumitra Bhavya, and Vinitadeva. Some doctrines peculiar to them were the Bodhisattva takes any form of lower existence for enlightening the beings of the world. So the Bodhisattva make a choice to be born in lower states in order to enlighten people. This the Theravadins do not agree with. Bodhisattva enters the mother's womb as a white elephant. The Kathavattu attributes to the Shailas the view that the Bodhisattva's 6 sense organs appear simultaneously while he is in the womb. So there was more and more mystery introduced to the story related to the Bodhisattva. He does not pass through the embryonic stages according to their view. The Bodhisattva has in his mind no trace of desire, hatred, and malice. It is evident that it is the Mahasanghikas who began the process of elevating the Bodhisattva above the Arahats. So the Mahasanghikas actually gave a higher status to the Bodhisattvas than to the Arahats. And this is a process that culminated in the Mahayana, the ideal of the Bodhisattva, as against the ideal of the Arahat. Kathavattu, chapter 23, section 3, mentions as a view rejected by the Theravada that the Bodhisattva opts to be born in unhappy abodes out of his own free will to help other beings. This is considered as a heresy in the Kathavattu. Bodhisattva issariya kama karaka hetu vinipatang gacchati. He selects lower realms for the purpose of a higher goal of instruction. The Theravada does not recognize the Bodhisattvas as superior in attainment to the Shravakas. It does not make any distinction in terms of value in the practice of the higher life and the noble path between the Shravaka and the Bodhisattva. So Theravada was opposed to this attachment of a higher value to this ideal, which was called the Bodhisattva ideal. Of course, Theravada recognized that few people can commit themselves to the goal of attaining Buddhahood in a future life. And actually, at a much later time, even the concept of Bodhi was recognized as consisting of different kinds of Bodhi. And the concept of Shravaka Sambodhi also developed, the enlightenment of the Shravaka. So new points of view were affirmed by the Mahasanghikas regarding the nature of the Buddha's teachings. They held that though the Buddha is always in Samadhi, sentient beings think that they have heard discourses from him in well-constructed sentences. Kathavattu mentions a view that the Buddha never gave discourses. Buddhena Bhagavatana Desito. There were even such views at the time. By just one utterance or word, the Buddha can expound all doctrines. Vasumitra's treatise attributed to the Mahasanghikas the view that the Buddha taught only the ultimate truth, Paramartha Satya. It cannot be explained by words, but only by silence, or at the most by an exclamation. The devaluation of the ideal of the Arahat really begins with the Mahasangika tradition. The Mahasanghikas believed that the Arahats realized only half the truth. The question whether Arahats need the help of others to realize the truth was raised in this regard. Theravada recognizes the knowledge of the Arahat consisting of Chatumagga Jnana, the knowledge pertaining to the attainment of the four paths. They admitted that the Arahat has no omniscient knowledge. That is, of course, admitted in the Theravada tradition. The Arahats are not omniscient. But in my view, even this concept of omniscience may have gone through a course of development within the Buddhist tradition. The Uttarapathakas regarded some of the Arahats as imposters. The Mahasanghika view was that even an Arahat can fall from his attainment. The Kathavattu, section 1, chapter 1, section 2 discusses this under Parihayati Araha Arahatta. The Arahat falls from his Arahatship. The Kathavattu vehemently opposes that view. So 18 schools of Buddhism are supposed to have developed from the two major schools, Theravada and Mahasanghika. And Vinitadeva divided the 18 schools that developed out of the two major schools into 5 groups. These are the 5 groups that Vinitadeva introduced. Groups 1 and 2. Mahasanghika, comprising Purva Shaila, Apara Shaila, and so forth. Then group 3, Sarvastivada, comprising Mulasarastivada and the other schools. Group 4, Sammitiya, comprising Kaurukullaka and others. Group 5, Stavira, which actually identifies the Stavira in terms of the Theravada that developed in the Sri Lankan tradition as Jetavaniya. These were much later established schools of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Jetavaniya, Abhayagiri Vasin, and Mahavihara Vasin. So Vinitadeva's classification points to a much later date. The doctrine of tritemporal existence of everything, Sarvastivada. According to the Pali tradition, Mahisasakas were the first to secede, to separate from the Theravada. They produced the offshoots called Dharmaguptikas, Sabbhativadins, Kassapikas, Sankantikas, and Suttavadins. Sarvastivada is likely to have arisen about 150 years after the Buddha's demise. Sarvastivada is well known for its substantialist metaphysics. Their doctrine was the main target of the Mahayana philosophers like Nagarjuna, Asanga, and Aryadeva. In fact, the Shunyata thesis of the Mahayana can be considered as a response mainly to Sarvastivada realism. So actually Theravada did not affirm that kind of realism. The Jnana Prasthana Shastra of Katyayani Putra contended that the objects in the present have their pastness and futurity. And this view was refuted by Moggalliputta in the Kathavattu. So the Theravadins refuted this view about the tri-temporal existence of the Dhammas. A major heresy refuted in the Kathavattu is this theory of the tri-temporal reality of Dhammas. According to the Theravada, it amounts to confusing our common usage, making all reference to 3 times meaningless. So from the Theravada viewpoint, this doctrine is meaningless. That actually makes our reference to the past, present, and the future meaningless. That which is past or future cannot exist, or if it were to exist, it will be both present and past. And same with the future. So the Theravadins vehemently protested against this theory. The Sammitiya school argued that it is not possible for the aggregates to transmigrate without a Pudgala. So they considered that there is a Pudgala, an individual, but that individual is not definable. It is neither identical with nor different from the khandhas, the aggregates. This theory has been severely criticized not only by the Theravada, but also by Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu. The Sammitiyas quote the Bharahara Sutta in support of their thesis, because the Buddha speaks here about the khandhas as a burden and the person, Puggala, as the carrier of the burden. In the Bharahara Sutra, you will find the Buddha saying that there is a Bharaharo, and the Bharaharo is the Puggala, the carrier of the burden. And the Bhara represents the 5 aggregates. They also depended on statements like Atti Puggalo, Attahitaya Patipanno. Now, these statements are found in the canonical sources. The Buddha in the Anguttara Nikaya, for instance, sometimes talks about classification of persons in these terms. And actually, the Theravada Abhidhamma also admitted a text called Puggala Panya, where the concept of Puggala was discussed. Then there are statements like Eka Puggalo Loke Uppajjamano Uppajjati Bahujana Hitad, referring to the Buddha. There is a single person born in this world for the benefit of the many. In order to affirm that the Puggala mentioned in those instances stand for something positive, they quoted these passages. The main argument of the Puggalavadins was that in order to give a rational explanation to concepts such as moral responsibility and rebirth, it is necessary to postulate a constant factor besides the constantly changing Dhammas. So this, the Theravada tradition felt as going back to the Vedic tradition, which actually introduced the soul theory. It's like a soul theory in disguise. So the Theravadins were not in agreement with this interpretation. The Theravadins argued, if the concept of person is of this nature, it cannot either be conditioned, sankhata, or unconditioned, asankhata. If something is not describable that way as something sankhata or sankhata, it cannot exist in a real sense. Because for the Theravadins, if something exists in a real sense, it has to be either conditioned or unconditioned. The Kathavattu of the Theravada tradition makes no distinction between the person and the self. So, Puggalavada is the same as Attavada, the self in the sense of Atta. The question for the Theravada was not whether the person exists or not. Their question was whether the person exists in a real and ultimate sense. That was the question that the Theravada was interested in. Because the Theravada also made use of the word self, vohara. In conventional discourse, the Theravada also used the term self. So from the Theravada point of view, the main question, the issue, was whether the person exists in a real and ultimate sense. So this is emphasized in the Kathavattu, when the self-theory of the Puggalavadins is refuted. In the early tradition also, the Buddha himself makes it clear that his objection is to the admission of a self as a truly existent entity. Satchato tetato. That expression has been used by the Buddha himself. Satchato tetato. There was a tendency to identify the Buddha with the nihilists, those who believed in total destruction. But the Buddha pointed out that he cannot be identified with the nihilists. He cannot be identified either with the soul theorists or with the nihilists, because he took the middle way of using the self terminology, but not talking about a self that has real and ultimate existence. So for the Theravada, the person exists in a conventional sense, but not like the Dhammas. So in the Theravada tradition, a certain theory was developed to counter the self theory. And that can be considered as the Dhamma theory of the Theravada. The Dhamma can be said to exist in a real and ultimate sense, but the soul or the self cannot exist in a real and ultimate sense. So Dhammas, the Theravada resorted to the use of the term Dhammas, that is the analyzed ultimates, the ultimates to which reality was analyzed. They can exist. as real Dhammas. Theravada and Vibhajyavada. This is an interesting distinction to be made. There is a tradition of identifying the Theravada with Vibhajyavada. The term Theravada occurs in the suttas with Jnanavada. But it is obvious that it is not a reference to the school of Buddhism that came to be known by that name. The term Vibhajyavada occurs in the technical sense that it is the method of giving a qualified answer to a question, an analytical explanation, or making a conditional assertion in contrast to Ekangsavada, meaning a categorical assertion. That is what the Buddha meant when he said that I am Vibhajyavadi. I am not Ekangsavadi. I don't give any categorical answer to all questions. There are certain questions that can be categorically answered. There are others which can be answered by after analysis and so forth. So the term Vibhajyavada came to be used to refer to Theravada in a certain historical context. It is possible to trace it to the traditional account of the Third Buddhist Council. This account is found in the Mahavansa and the two commentaries to the Vinaya and the Kathavatu. In these accounts, there is a narration of events that led to the main event of purification of the Sasana and holding the Third Buddhist Council. In the intervention of King Asoka in this event, it is said that he expelled 60,000 monks who held wrong views regarding the teaching of the Buddha. The monks who responded to the question of the king, maintaining that the Buddha's teaching is a Vibhajyavada, were retained. That is how this link between Theravada and Vibhajyavada came into being. Although it is true that analysis plays an important role both in the Sutta and the Abhidhamma collections, synthesis is also found to be important. So the Dhamma theory of Theravada Abhidhamma is based not only on analysis, Veda, but also on synthesis, Sangha. Now this point is very effectively argued by Professor Y. Karunadasa in one of his papers. So I agree to a great extent with Professor Karunadasa's analysis of this issue. So contrary to the Vimati Vinodini, a sub-commentary to the Vinaya, which says that the Buddha is Ekanta Vibhajyasila, it appears that this is not in agreement with the early Theravada approach. In the early Theravada approach, going by the canonical Buddhist classification of questions into 4 groups, we have the acceptance of different types of questions. Panyo ekansa vyakaraniyo, a categorically answerable question. Panyo vibhajya vyakaraniyo, an analytically answerable question. Panyo patipuccha vyakaraniyo, a question to be answered by counter questioning, and panyo tapanyo, a question to be left aside. So all four methods of answering are valid, and no method is to be taken as superior to the other. Regarding the second category, which is especially relevant to our discussion, there is an instance in the Subha Sutta where the Buddha responds to a question raised by Subha, saying, Vibhajyavado aham, manava naham ettha ekansavado. It means, I think we have to lay emphasis on this term ettha. Here, in that context, the Buddha says, here, O young man, I give an analytical explanation. I do not make here a categorical assertion. So that doesn't mean that the Buddha is always giving an analytical explanation. It only says that in that context, he is giving an analytical explanation. So that is the point that Professor Karunadasa tries to clarify, that the Buddha's teaching was not really Vibhajyavada in the sense that in all his teachings he was Vibhajyavada. He was introducing Vibhajyavada. But in certain instances, he was taking the analytical approach. So this does not support the position that the Buddha always follows Vibhajyavada in preference to Ekansavada. So if the Buddha was asked, does suffering exist? He would have said, of course, definitely suffering does exist. So there is a similar instance in the Anguttara Nikaya where the Buddha uses the term Vibhajyavada, saying that he censures the censurable and praises the praiseworthy by taking an analytical approach. Here too, the term ettha is used, meaning in this context. It is clear that the Buddha, depending on the situation, resorted to both non-categorical and categorical modes of explanation. The Buddha on one occasion tells Pottapada that he has taught categorical as well as non-categorical Dhamma. These references in no way support the conclusion that the use of the term Vibhajyavada is intended to show that Buddhism endorses only analysis, and that therefore Buddhism is the religion of analysis. So it is important to point out that the identification of Theravada with Vibhajyavada came into being at a certain historical point in the tradition. That is what Professor Karunadasa has clarified in his discussion. Why is the term Vibhajyavada used in the third council context without any further qualification? It is used in such a way as to distinguish the teaching of the Buddha from such theories as eternalism and annihilationism. The reason for using the term has to be understood in its real historical context. The Abhidharmakosha Bhashya can give us a clue to the significance of the usage. It says, those who maintain, after having analyzed that some things exist, namely the present and the past karma, which has not borne its fruit, and some things do not exist, namely the past which has borne its fruit, and future, are called Vibhajyavadis. Here the reference is to the Buddhist controversy on the tri-temporality of the dharmas. And here the Vibhajyavadins are identified as Kashyapiyas. In all probability, the Theravadins also came to be called Vibhajyavadins because of the position they took in respect of this self-same controversial issue. This is supported by Theravada sources as well. The Theravadin response to the controversial issue is that only the Dhamma's present phase of time exists, whereas the Dhammas in the past and future phases of time do not exist. This follows from the Vibhajyavada method. The first chapter of the Vijñānakaya of the Sarvastivada Abhidharma Pitaka, whose authorship is attributed to Deva Sharman, is called Maudgalyayana Khandaka. It is quite likely that the reference is to the elder Moggaliputta who convened the Third Council. What we find in the text is a criticism of the views expressed by the elder Moggaliputta in rejecting the theory of tri-temporality. So the Sarvastivada tradition disagreed with the Theravadins regarding the Theravada view on tri-temporality. In introducing the Buddhist doctrine of causality in the Visuddhimagga, Buddhaghosa says that he will give a full exposition of it by delving into the Vibhajyavadi Mandala. The Theravadin rejection of the Sarvastivadi theory of tri-temporality has a direct relevance to the Buddhist doctrine of causality. A similar idea finds expression in the colophon of the commentary to the P.D. Premasiri, where we get the Abhidhamma doctrine of conditional relations. The all exists theory played a very important role in the post-Asokan history of Buddhism. This explains the significance of the term Vibhajyavada in characterizing Theravada. The Dhamma theory of Theravada. We come to a brief discussion of this aspect now. The term Dhamma plays the key role in the exposition of Theravada conception of reality. The term takes a new technical usage which goes beyond its early Sutta usage in the Theravada Abhidhamma. According to the Abhidhamma of the Theravada tradition, Dhamma embraces not only the basic factors into which the whole of phenomenal existence is resolved, but also the unconditioned reality which is conceived as Nibbana. In the earlier texts, the expression Sabbe Dhamma was used in a general sense to talk about all things. In the later Theravada Abhidhamma, meaning Sabbe Dhamma assumes a technical sense to mean the basic factors into which all things can be resolved. Earlier, it was all things in general. But in the Theravada meaning, new meaning that Theravada gave to Sabbe Dhamma, it has assumed a technical sense. That is, the basic factors into which all things can be resolved. So, according to the Dhamma theory of the Abhidhamma, all the observable phenomena are made up of a number of elementary constituents. They are the ultimate realities behind the phenomena that become manifest. The entire Abhidhamma rests on the Dhamma theory. It probably arose from the meditative experience in the beginning, basing it upon meditative contemplation and insight. The theory is compatible with the Buddha's instruction to perceive the world not as consisting of self-entities and substances, but bare phenomena arising and perishing, depending upon conditions. The Abhidhamma attempted to specify these bare phenomena in order to show the realities underlying our common sense experience of the world. In the Theravada tradition, the Dhamma theory did not remain static. It was enriched over a long period of time through commentarial exegesis and compendiums and manuals of Abhidhamma. In the Sutta period itself, the psychophysical reality of the individual came to be analyzed in a number of different ways, breaking it into constituent parts as name and form, 5 aggregates, 6 dhatus, 12 spheres of sense, and 18 elements. Each of these forms of analysis had a practical reason behind it. The analytical bent of the Abhidhamma period gave rise to the view that none of the 5 analyses mentioned is exhaustive. So they went beyond the canonical analytical system. It is this understanding that led to the analysis of the world of experience to what came to be known as Dhammas. The Theravada, going by this method, broke down the aggregate of matter into 28 items as Rupa Dhammas. The next 3 aggregates, feeling, perception, and mental formations, are together arranged into 52 items called Chetasikas. The 5th, consciousness, is counted as 1 item with 89 varieties and referred to as Chitta. So this is how the Theravada ended up in its analysis of Dhammas. Other schools of Buddhism also followed this method of analysis, but unlike the Theravada, the Sarvastivada ended up in a pluralistic realism. That is, they ended up in affirming the reality of things in the 3 times. Theravada, however, avoided it by combining analysis with synthesis. Taking this standpoint, the commentarial explanations of the Theravada tried to show that the Dhamma theory should not be misunderstood in such a way that it leads to a reductionist view of existence, leading to nihilism. So, unlike the Sarvastivada school, the Theravadins did not resort to a reductionist view, ending up in identifying certain ultimate elements without synthesizing them. So, as distinct entities, they can't remain at any time. They always have to exist in relation. Thus, following the Buddha's middle way philosophy, the Theravada Dhamma theory tried to avoid both eternalism and nihilism and maintain related existence or the existence of things in dependent relationship. Theravada, as we have already seen, rejected the Sarvastivadi theory of the tritemporal existence of Dhammas. However, the Theravada was influenced by the Sarvastivada doctrine of Swabhava, or own being. This term, though not found in the Abhidhamma Pitaka, came to be introduced in the Abhidhamma exegesis. The commentaries define Dhammas as things that bear their own nature. Attano sabhavang dharenti Dhamma. The Theravada did not imply by this that there is a duality between the Dhamma and its qualities. Such duality, as the Theravada exegesis points out, is limited to the conventional modes of expressing our experience of things. Theravada introduced three kinds of definition pertaining to Dhammas as Kattu Sadhana, agency definition; Karana Sadhana, instrumental definition; and Bhava Sadhana, definition by nature. What is admissible in the last ultimate sense is the last one, that is Bhava Sadhana. So things exist merely as activities. This avoids the notion of a duality within a unitary Dhamma. It is categorically stated that apart from Sabhava, there is no distinct entity called Dhamma. Nacha Sabhava Anyo Dhammo Nama Atti. It is the interconnection of Dhammas through causal relations that explains the variety and diversity of conditioned existence, and not some kind of trans-empirical reality which serves as their metaphysical ground. It denies the theistic belief in a creator God as well. To avoid the misunderstanding that a Dhamma could be seen as some kind of quasi-substance, another definition was introduced to say that they are Dhammas because they are born by their own conditions. Paccayehi dhariyantiti Dhamma. A Dhamma is not a bearer, but is born by its own conditions. So the agency view is somehow rejected in the Theravada. The Patisambhida Magga says that the khandhas are devoid of own nature. In this case, could an incompatibility arise regarding the own nature of Dhammas? This is avoided by the use of the term Sabhava, not to mean that it implies a substantial mode of being. Dhammas have no sway over anything. They are powerless because they exist dependent on impermanent conditions. So that is how the nature of Dhammas was conceived in the Theravada tradition. Dhamma is also defined as its own characteristic. According to this definition, Dhammas are so called because they bear their own characteristic. Salakkana. Visibility, for instance, is the own characteristic of color. It is the characteristic which separates it from other characteristics. Hence, it is called Visesa Lakkana or the Asadharana Lakkana. However, there is no duality between the Dhamma and the characteristic. If that is so, it could lead to the substance attribute distinction. So the Theravada always tried to avoid the substance attribute distinction at the ultimate level. So the Dhamma is the Lakkana itself. There is no distinction assumed between the characteristic and what is characterized by it. To further avoid misunderstanding, the Theravada exegesis define Dhamma as that which is characterized by others, which means that the characteristic of a Dhamma is brought about by and is therefore dependent on other Dhammas. So Dhamma can never exist in itself. In what sense can the Dhammas represent the final limits into which empirical existence can be analyzed? In answer to this question, Theravada exegesis presented the concept of Paramartha. Paramartha is sometimes paraphrased as the actual, Bhutattha, what which really has become. The Dhammas are not fictitious entities like soul or primordial nature, but what could be known by insight. They have objective existence and are cognizable in an ultimate sense. They also maintain that the essential characteristic of a Dhamma is unalterable, aviparita bhava. Another aspect of the Dhamma theory is that the Dhammas, both mental and material, are not separable from one from another. They are, however, presented as a plurality because they are distinguishable one from another. They are not separable, but they are distinguishable. In the Abhidhamma sub-commentaries, it is maintained that the real nature of things that are distinguishable can be brought into focus only through analysis. So analysis is for the purpose of drawing the distinctions. Another characteristic pertaining to the relative position of the Dhammas is their conditionedness, sappacchayata. Following from this, the Dhammas are seen as invariably arising in clusters. So the Dhammas, because they are conditioned, they arise only in clusters. There are no solitary phenomena, either in the domain of matter or in the sphere of the mind. In the domain of matter, also Dhammas arise independence. In the sphere of mind, also Dhammas arise depending upon other Dhammas. Now we have a look at the Theravada concept of Paññatti. In the Dhamma theory of Theravada, only the ultimate reality of Dhammas is affirmed. Common sense view of the world recognizes realities more or less corresponding to all linguistic terms. That is the common sense view of reality. Corresponding to every linguistic term, we think that there is some objective existence. The Theravada concept of Panyati provides an explanation for the kind of relation between the Dhammas which are conceived as the basic factors of reality and the objects of common sense realism. So Panyati are concepts or designations. It is on the same basis that Theravada drew a distinction between two kinds of truth as conventional truth, Sammuti Satcha, and Paramattha Satcha, ultimate truth. In most systems of Indian philosophy associated with the Atma tradition, a substantialist view of existence was proposed, defining time, space, unity, identity, universality, etc. as absolutes. Theravada, keeping to the early Buddhist position on these matters, attempted to explain such categories without committing themselves to metaphysical assumptions. The term Panyati conveys such meanings as making known, laying down, manifestation, designation, application, notion, and concept. The use of the term in the Abhidhamma can be traced to the Potthapada Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. The Buddha makes the statement in this context, that is, where he addresses Chitta, who was concerned about the Buddha speaking of the same person, the person who existed yesterday, the same person existing now, and that same person may exist in the future. And the Buddha says, these chitta are worldly conventions, loka samanya, linguistic expressions of the world, loka nirutyo, ways of worldly speech, loka vohara, and worldly designations, loka panyatyo, which the Tathagata uses without clinging to them. Voharati aparamasam. So the Buddha tried to show that we can use terms like that, but they don't represent absolute objective realities. In the Niruttipata Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya too, the Buddha made the same point about the division of time into past, present, and future. The usage is here described as Niruttipata, Adivachanapata, Panyatipata. The Dhamma Sangani introduces a number of equivalents in explaining the term Panyati as Ya te sang dhammanang sankha samanya panyati voharo namang namakaranang namadeyang nirutti vyanjanang abhilapo. Now, Rhys Davids translates this as that which is an enumeration, that which is a designation, an expression, a current term, a name, a denomination, the assigning of a name, an interpretation, a distinctive mark of discourse on this or that Dhamma. In these terms, the Dhammasangani says that all Dhammas are pathways of designation. Sabbe Dhamma Panyati Patha. This is to say that all Dhammas can be designated by linguistic terms. Explaining the above, the Pali commentary says that Panyati means the process of predicating. The function of it is, therefore, to predicate anything through the symbolic medium of language. According to the commentary, there is nothing that escapes the possibility of being named. So Panyati represents names as opposed to Dhamma or Paramattha. This shows that there are two levels of reality, as the conceptual and the real. The former depends on the operation of mind, and the latter exists independent of the operations of the mind. The full implications of the technical use of the term Panyati in the Theravada Abhidhamma is worked out in the commentaries. The commentarial exegesis points out that Panyati cannot be subsumed under Nama or Rupa. So they say that they are Nama, Rupa, Vimurta. This is to say that Panyati are not Dhamma. Panyati are sometimes referred to as Asabhava Dhamma, Dhamma without own nature, because it refers to that which has no corresponding objective counterpart. The three salient characteristics of empirical reality are not applied to them. So, Panyati are not brought about by conditions. They are not positively produced. Aparinippanna. Only a Dhamma that has an own nature and marked by the three salient characteristics of conditioned existence is positively produced. So temporal distinctions as past, present, and future do not apply to Panyati. They have no own nature to be manifested in the three instances of arising, Uppada, presence, Titi, and dissolution, Bhanga. They have no reference to time. They are Kala Vimutta. They have no place among the khandhas. They cannot be assigned any place in any of the four planes of existence recognized in Buddhist cosmology. They cannot be described either as conditioned or unconditioned. So they are not real entities. A Panyati is a thing merely conceptualized. Parikappa Siddha. Panyati exists by virtue of conceptual thought. So they are reduced to conceptual thought. Theravada Abhidhamma makes a distinction between two kinds of Panyati as Nama Panyati and Attha Panyati. The former represents the mere mode of recognizing by way of this or that word whose significance is determined by worldly convention. It is a product of worldly convention. Loka, Sanketa, Nimmita. The latter represents ideas, notions, or concepts corresponding to the names, words, signs, or symbols. It is produced by the interpretative and synthesizing function of the mind, kappana, and is based on the various forms of appearance presented by the real existence when they are in particular situations or positions. Both have a psychological origin and as such are devoid of objective reality. The distinction made above represents a distinction between a name and its meaning. Names can be assigned to Dhammas, which constitute the category of the real. However, names given to Dhammas do not have corresponding Attha Panyati, concepts as meanings. What this suggests is that objects of conceptual thought, like tables and chairs, are easily recognizable, whereas the Dhammas are difficult to be grasped. It is through the transcendence of the Panyati level, Panyati Atikamana, that one can establish one's own mind on the real Dhammas. In this connection, the meditator should go beyond such concepts as earth element, water element, etc., and establish his mind directly on the individuating characteristics that correspond to them, such as solidity, viscidity, etc. Yes, I think we will run short of time. So I will try to shorten this discussion by referring to the 6 kinds of Nama Panyati as mentioned in the Abhidhamma tradition. 6 kinds of Nama Panyati are mentioned as Vijjamana Panyati, Avijjamana Panyati, Vijjamanena Avijjamana Panyati, Avijjamanena Vijjamana Panyati, Vijjamanena Vijjamana Panyati, and Avijjamanena Avijjamana Panyati. So one can think of examples of this. Now, if you take dukkha, for instance, it would be a Vijjamana Panyati because dukkha really is something that is evident. But Avijjamana Panyati, person, Puggala, is an Avijjamana Panyati because there are no persons in real existence. Then Vijjamanena Avijjamana Panyati. An example would be now if you say Chakhu, it has real existence as an entity. I can, at the moment, an example, real example does not come to my mind. Well, I'll go to an example of Avijjamanena Vijjamana Panyati. If you say Acharyasa Chakku, Acharyasya Chakku. Now the Acharya, the teacher, as a real entity does not exist. But he has the Chakku Dhatu as a real entity. So Acharyasya Chakku would be an Avijjamanena Vijjamana Panyati, according to this analysis. So similarly, you can find examples for the others as well. So we can rush through this concept of the two truths. In early Buddhism, the search for a single truth, which can be characterized as the absolute truth, appears to be discouraged. As far as the Buddha was concerned, he focused attention on what could be useful to mankind in order to overcome suffering and also to transform humans from an ethically deprived condition to an ethically purified condition. So he characterized the truths he taught as noble truths, or truths leading to the attainment of ultimate peace. The later distinction drawn in the Buddhist tradition between two kinds of truth as conventional truth, sammuti satcha, and ultimate truth, paramattha satcha, is an abhidhammic innovation. Although it may be justified in terms of the early teaching. So it can be inferred from the early teaching, but it was not found in that form in the early teaching. A similar distinction is drawn in the Anguttara Nikaya between two kinds of discourse as nitattha and neyattha. It was probably the nitattha neyattha distinction that provided the base for the subsequent doctrine of double truth. Not only in Theravada, but also other Buddhist schools. This doctrine of double truth came to be known in other schools as well. The commentary to the Anguttara Nikaya clearly seeks to establish a correspondence between the Sutta passage and the Theravada version of the two truths. In the schools of Sanskrit Buddhism, Nitatha is evaluated as higher than Neyartha. That is, Nitatha is absolute and it's higher. In the Theravada, no such evaluation is made. But it is said that one makes an error if a Neyattha Sutta is interpreted as a Nitattha Sutta, and vice versa. Both are truths, according to the Theravada. There is no higher and lower status, according to this. There is no doubt that the doctrine of double truths in the Theravada context is an extension of the Dhamma theory. There are instances in the suttas where the terms sammuti and vohara are used in order to show that language functions as a means of communication and that it could be used meaningfully as long as one does not get misled by it. The term paramattha, however, is not found as one that qualifies truth, although there are contexts in which there is reference to the attainment of Nibbana as Paramattha Patti. In the early suttas, Paramattha is not used to qualify truth. We can't find an instance in the suttas. But Paramattha refers to Nibbana. Paramattha is the highest attainment, the highest well-being that a person can attain. So it is not so much in the sense of attaining absolute truth, but in the sense of attaining the highest well-being that the term Paramattha Patti was used. There is no ontological sense attached to it. Although one could see that in an evaluative sense, one could see that an evaluative sense is attached. Paramattha in the sense of higher. In a value dimension, it's higher. Even the term parama has sometimes been used with satya, implying the direct verification of the truth of Nibbana as parama satchang satchikaroti. Parama satchang satchikaroti in early Buddhism, in the Sutta tradition, is realization of Nibbana. Here too, without the implication of any ontological meaning, but only as higher in the value sense. It becomes clear from the above that the Theravada doctrine of two truths introduces something further than what we can find in the early Buddhist teaching. It is important to note one interesting feature of the Theravada version of the theory of double truths, namely the use of sammuti for relative truth. Other schools of Buddhist thought use the term sangvruti. As Professor Karunadasa notes, the difference between sammuti and sangvruti is not simply that between Pali and Sanskrit. For the two terms differ both in etymology and meaning. Sangvruti and sammuti actually etymologically also are different. Sammuti is derived from the roots man, to think, and sangvruti is derived from the root vru, to cover. So in the Mahayana sense, sangvruti is that which conceals the real truth. So there is a real truth behind what is concealed. In the Theravada usage, sammuti satya means truth based on convention or general agreement. It is not something covered. It is the conventional truth that we agree upon. So, from the Theravada point of view, we can understand the same reality at these two levels. So, when the Buddhas talk about, or when the Buddhas use Sammuti Satya and Paramattha Satya, they are talking about the same thing, according to the Theravada. The Paramattha Satya is not some concealed reality outside the sphere of convention. So in a number of Pali commentaries, it is said that the Buddha himself proclaimed two kinds of truth as conventional and ultimate truth, and a third does not exist. It is further said, statements referring to convention-based things, sanketa, are valid because they are based on common agreement. Statements referring to ultimate categories are valid because they are based on the nature of the real existence. This implies that the validity of the term table is based not on an objectively existent corresponding existence corresponding to the term, but on mentally superimposing some unity on an organized whole or material Dhamma. So there is an organized whole or material Dhamma, which is called the table. So that is true at the conventional level. The table is not a separate reality distinct from the material dhammas that enter into its composition. But in common parlance, it is accepted as a separate reality. The paramattha denotes a category of real existence. They have their own sabhava. That is how Theravada interpreted this distinction. The Theravada clearly avoids considering one truth as higher than the other, while other Buddhist traditions attempted to maintain such a view. According to the commentaries, the Buddha chooses to teach the Dhamma in sammuti mode or paramattha mode, depending on the nature of the persons to whom he teaches. So the Buddha sometimes taught in the sammuti mode, sometimes taught in the paramattha mode. And whatever the mode the Buddha used, the hearers understood what the Buddha taught, because he taught the same truth. Both modes can be used for teaching what is true. It is compared to someone using two different languages to convey the same truth. So, the same truth can be understood when taught in two different languages by those who understand the two different languages. So, the Theravadins considered the two truths actually as the use of two different languages. So there is no distinction between the truths taught. It is the mode of the teaching, the means of the teaching that is different. So Paramattha Satya really means the truth expressed by using the technical terms expressive of the ultimate factors of existence. It should also be remembered that both truths are subsumed under Paññatti. Now, there is this section which is a little, I think we will not have time to go over it. So I will just show it to you. The Theravada analysis of the cognitive process. The Theravada introduced a very elaborate analysis of the cognitive process. That is, how cognition takes place from the point at which an object impinges on the sense organ, and then how that object is registered in the human mind. So the entire process is analyzed in terms of the Theravada theory of momentary existence. It is in moments or through a process of momentary events that this cognition takes place. And in this context, the concept of bhavanga also came to be introduced in the Theravada Abhidhamma theory. So we do not have enough time to discuss that. Then introduction of Theravada to Sri Lanka and its historical process. According to the Sri Lankan tradition, missionaries from the Buddhist order were sent to various lands during the reign of Asoka. on the recommendation of Venerable Moggaliputta. From the time of the completion of the Second Council, the Stavira order became more influential in Western India. The Sri Lankan tradition attributes to Venerable Mahinda, one of King Asoka's sons, as the person who introduced Theravada Buddhism to Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan tradition holds that there was friendship between King Asoka and King Devanampiyatissa even before the introduction of Buddhism. When Venerable Mahinda arrived, the king received him and the message of Buddhism with great respect and veneration, and also constructed the Mahavihara for Venerable Mahinda and his followers. Mahinda's younger sister, Venerable Sangamitta, also subsequently arrived in Sri Lanka, bringing a cutting from the Bodhi tree, and was planted in the capital city of Anuradhapura. She was also responsible for establishing the order of nuns. The Abhayagiri Vihara was constructed in the 1st century BCE, and it became the base for a second major sect of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka. During the reign of King Voharikatissa, an elder of the Vajjiputtaka school in India named Dhammaruchi and his disciples were welcomed by the Abhayagiri sect. A number of adherents of the Vetullavada sect of Mahayana Buddhism came to Sri Lanka during this period, and they were allowed to stay in the Abhayagiri Vihara by the monks. The king intervened and expelled these Indian monks. The Vetullavada monks later reasserted their influence at the Abhayagiri Vihara. This led to another split when, in protest, a group of monks from Abhayagiri left the monastery and established the third sect at Dakkhinagiri during the reign of King Gotabaya. It came to be known as the Sagaliya sect and was associated with the Jetavana monastery. Later, during the reign of King Mahasena, there were some sectarian conflicts, which, however, did not last long. In the 5th century, during the reign of King Mahanama, the great commentator Buddhaghosa came to Sri Lanka. Besides writing commentaries to most of the works of the Pali Canon, he also authored the famous work called the Visuddhimagga. Buddhaghosa's formulation of Theravada doctrines has remained the standard one until the present time. The rivalry between the Mahavihara and the Abhayagiri sects continued through the centuries. Mahavihara always attempted to preserve a purer form of Theravada doctrine and monastic discipline. During the first half of the 8th century, Mahayana and esoteric Buddhism were practiced in Sri Lanka. Two of the monks responsible for promulgating esoteric Buddhism in China, Vajra Bodhi and Amogha Vajra, visited the island during this period. In the first half of the 11th century, during the reign of Mahinda V, Sri Lanka was invaded by the Shaivite Chola dynasty of South India, and they destroyed the capital city and Buddhist monasteries. However, after a century of fighting, Vijayabahu I was able to defeat the Cholas and restore the monarchy. He also invited Buddhist elders from Burma to restore Buddhism in Sri Lanka. In the 12th century, King Parakramabahu I expelled the decadent monks in the Mahavihara, Abhayagiri and Jetavana sects and purified the Buddhist order in Sri Lanka. This enabled Theravada Buddhism to flourish until the time of the destructive invasions from countries of the Western world during the colonial period. However, up to the present day, Sri Lanka has been able to preserve her Theravada identity, not permitting any infiltrations from opposing Buddhist sects. So this is in brief the history of Theravada in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Very comprehensive.
Yeah. I wonder if there is any time for any questions to be raised. We have actually exhausted all the time with the detailed discussion. But we can spend at least 5 minutes if there are any.
Professor.
Yeah.
There is, I'm wondering if possible, I haven't have your email, so I can write to you if we don't have much time to elaborate on some certain points. I'm
Okay.
to provide me.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have my email address?
I don't have.
Oh, it's I can write it now here.
Yes.
Yes, if I. Oh.
P.D.Premasiri at hotmail.com. I repeat.
Premasiri at hotmail.com.
P.Premasiri at hotmail.com. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, you're welcome, and thank you for arranging this audience today for me.
It's very wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yes.
You're welcome.
Yes.
And
Hope to see Ajahn again.
Yeah. Thank you for organizing this event. I enjoyed.
Enjoy and everyone happy and enjoy it, Ajahn. Yes.
So, do you have this text? I can email this text.
Yes, Prof. I need this text.
The entire text of the.
Yes. Certainly.
I will email that. So that will give you some sections that I skipped also. Yeah.
Prof, I will email to Prof, and then later Prof can.
Okay, right. I will send that.
Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Bye-bye.
He said, Teruvan Saranai in Sinhala.
Thank you very much.